Hey everyone, French Tutor here. Today's guide is going to be about Sanhua, a 4-star Glacio character who is considered a hybrid character who can deal both damage and support her party members. She is indispensable on many accounts as a support unit who buffs basic attack damage with her outro skill and can be also played as a sub DPS or even a main DPS with the right team with high liberation burst damage and short field time. Let's go over how to play her, her optimal flow chart, her best weapons, echoes, team comps, sequence nodes, and more. I highly recommend watching the beginning of this video to learn some basic and advanced tips on how to use her, but feel free to use the timestamps for your own needs. So yeah, let's get started. First, let's talk about her Forte abilities. Her 5-hit basic attack sequence is a standard 2-hit combo, followed by a 3rd hit where she twirls her sword in the air, and a 4th hit that hits twice, and a final 5th hit jump attack. The 5th hit is very important to her kit as a DPS unit if you want to maximize her damage output since it does a lot of damage and it provides certain buffs, which I will explain more in detail later. The first thing you want to learn is to animation cancel after the 5th hit since you cannot move once the attack is finished and there's a lot of end lag. You can do this by either dashing, using your skill, using your liberation, using your echo, using a heavy attack, swapping characters, or jumping if you're very low on stamina. Keep in mind that if you animation cancel too quickly, the 5th hit won't make contact, so practice the timing by delaying it a little more than usual. Next, you want to learn about her heavy attack, and she actually has 2 of them, which are both extremely important to her kit for both DPS and support builds. To understand them better, you first need to learn about her Forte gauge, which is this right here. The gauge has 2 areas, the white areas and the light blue area. The light blue area is called the frostbite area. When you hold your basic attack, a cursor will start moving from left to right and then back to left and it repeats. If the cursor falls in the white area and you release your basic attack, Sanhua will perform a normal heavy attack. If the cursor falls in the light blue area and you release your basic attack, Sanhua will perform a special kind of heavy attack called Heavy Attack Detonate. While you are holding your basic attack, Sanhua will start shining every time the cursor falls in the light blue frostbite area, so you can use this as a visual indicator instead of looking down at the gauge, but can be difficult to do when battles get hectic. Also, what makes Sanhua unique is that she can hold basic attack and walk around freely in case you need to dodge attacks, and helps you choose which heavy attack to use depending on the situation. This is an important mechanic which I will dive deeper into later. I'll first talk about her special heavy attack so you understand the importance of her normal heavy attack and basic attack 5 better. Sanhua's heavy attack detonate is used to detonate any ice that she creates from her resonance skill, liberation, and intro skill, which deals extra chip damage from the broken ice shards. This is known as ice burst, and this damage scales off of resonance skill damage, so let's keep this in mind when we talk about her build later. Heavy attack detonate has 2 hits that do the same damage. The initial hit can pierce through certain enemies, especially smaller ones, but she can't for other enemies, especially bigger ones. The initial hit also time stops an enemy hit from it until the final hit, which can guarantee your safety. The final hit of Heavy Attack Detonate triggers after a short pause and can down smaller enemies. You can easily use any attack right after the final hit to cancel the animation. The most common attacks being a normal heavy attack, your resonance skill, liberation, or swap cancel. There are 2 ways to swap cancel her heavy attack detonate. The first way is to immediately swap cancel right after you initiate the attack so you don't have to wait during the long animation. This is mainly only useful for DPS builds on a quick swap team who doesn't need her outro skill too much. This is because she does not trigger her outro skill if the final hit fills up her concerto gauge. The second way is to wait until either the first hit or the final hit fills up your concerto energy completely before you swap out. This way, you can use your outro skill almost immediately for your next party member. Now let's talk about her normal heavy attack. Keep in mind that this is mainly important to use for DPS builds. The main reason you want to use normal heavy attacks is because once you use it, it can skip the first 3 basic attacks and go straight to your 4th and 5th hit in your basic attack sequence. You can clearly see here that you can get to your basic attack 5 much quicker. So why is it so important to use and get to basic attack 5 quicker? First, if you have her S1 unlocked, which you probably will in the future, it will increase her crit rate by 15% for 10 seconds. Second, when you unlock her second inherent skill, Ice Burst damage will increase by 20% for 8 seconds after her basic attack 5. Third, it gives Sanhua 1 stack of clarity, which I will explain in a second. There are 2 ways to perform a normal heavy attack. The first and slower way is to hold your basic attack when you're not in the middle of an animation. When you do it like this, your first basic attack comes out. The second and fastest way is to hold your basic attack and release during an animation. This way, you skip your first basic attack and you can get to basic attack 5 quicker. Hold your basic attack and release quickly during your intro skill. Heavy attack detonate. The third hit of your echo skill. A plunge attack. And the most complicated but pretty useful way during a dash. This one might require practice where you press and hold basic attack and press dash at the same time. This will be much quicker than dashing towards an enemy and then using basic attack 1, so this technique is worth learning. Now let's talk about our Forte circuit in detail. I just mentioned what clarity was, which is Sanhua's stack mechanic, and its purpose is to expand the frostbite light blue area on her Forte gauge. There are 4 ways to obtain clarity. To gain 1 stack, you can use basic attack 5, your intro skill, or your resonance skill. To gain 2 stacks of clarity, you can use your resonance liberation. All stacks of clarity is removed once you use heavy attack detonate. 1 stack of clarity lasts for 5 seconds, and if you gain 1 more stack when you already have 1, the timer refreshes for the first stack. So if you gain 2 stacks of clarity, it lasts for 10 seconds, even if the first stack was about to run out. To be clear, clarity does not give any type of damage increase, but can help increase your damage over time because the wider the frostbite area is, the faster you can perform heavy attack detonate. With all that being said, you really don't have to worry too much about getting 2 stacks of clarity. 1 stack should be enough to be able to perform heavy attack detonate comfortably once you get used to the Forte gauge, but if it is difficult, feel free to try to gain 2 stacks each rotation. Clarity does come in handy though when you don't have any stacks because it can be pretty difficult to perform a heavy attack detonate without expanding the light blue frostbite area. Now let's talk about Ice Burst. As mentioned before, Ice Burst is when Sanhua's heavy attack detonate is used to detonate any ice that she creates from her resonance skill, liberation, and intro skill for extra chip damage from the broken ice shards. It has a decent amount of AoE even when enemies are not super close to the ice creations. And as long as Sanhua is relatively close to any of her ice creations during a heavy attack detonate, they should Ice Burst. She can detonate multiple ice creations and the Ice Burst damages stack. Also, if there are multiple ice creations on the field and she detonates just one of them, all ice creations will detonate at the same time. Ice Burst can also down smaller enemies and can be useful for some crowd control. The most important use for Ice Burst in my opinion is that it gives a ton of concerto energy, which makes it super important as a support. Even if you're not hitting an enemy, if you detonate an ice creation made from your resonance skill or liberation, you will gain concerto energy. You can technically abuse this in the overworld and fill up your concerto gauge when you need it. You will not gain any concerto energy when breaking in an ice thorn from your intro skill though. If you detonate multiple ice creations at once, the concerto energy stacks and you will gain a considerable amount. Along with heavy attack detonate hits and just using your liberation, you will fill up your concerto gauge super quickly as Sanhua. For a resonance skill, Sanhua creates an ice prism while jumping backwards. It has a cooldown of 10 seconds and the ice prism will last for 5 seconds. Although it has some horizontal range, it has pretty short reach against enemies in front of you, so it's best to use it up close. It also has short vertical range, so be careful when enemies are higher up than you or you might miss. Sometimes you want to dash cancel the long jump animation so that you're not stuck in one spot. When you dash cancel this animation, Sanhua will mid-air dash since her feet is off the ground. If you are not pressing any direction, she will do a backflip and furthering yourself from the enemy even more. If you are pressing forward or any other direction, she will move in that direction. I recommend then using a plunge attack while holding your basic attack and do a heavy attack detonate right away for an efficient combo. Dash canceling forward to a plunge attack is a great way to finish an enemy if heavy attack detonate is overkill. It's also good to use when you missed your skill because it was too short ranged. It gets you right back into the fight. Be careful not to animation cancel her skill animation too quickly or even her ice prism will not come out and you will do no damage. The most common follow-up to your resonance skill is a heavy attack detonate, so I don't recommend any other type of animation cancel other than a dash cancel. The only exception being is if your liberation goes up right after you use your skill, then you can cancel out the skill animation with your liberation if you want to. For her resonance liberation, Sanhua creates a glacier and is a very strong attack. It has an energy cost of 100, which is one of the lowest in the game, and a cooldown of 16 seconds. The glacier will last 5 seconds. It has a little bit more reach compared to her skill and much more horizontal range, but unfortunately still lacks vertical range. So again, be careful when enemies are even slightly above you or it will miss. Try your best to line up enemies in a row to hit them all at once. Because it's so strong, you can use it to reduce enemies' vibration strength by a lot, potentially downing them in one shot. Ideally, as a DPS, you should use heavy attack detonate right away for some extra damage with Ice Burst. As a support, either you can use heavy attack detonate or your resonance skill. For her intro skill, Sanhua jumps into battle and creates an Ice Thorn, which will last 8 seconds. It has a little bit more vertical range than her resonance skill and liberation. And her outro skill is one of the best ones in the game. The incoming party member has their basic attack damage amplified by 38% for 14 seconds or until they swap out. This is a huge boost to a lot of characters, which I will go more in detail in the team section. For her first inherent skill, her resonance skill damage is increased by 20% for 8 seconds after using her intro skill. Her second inherent skill increases Ice Burst damage by 20% for 8 seconds after using basic attack 5. Now for echo skills. For a DPS build, she will use Lampy Lumen Myriad. It has a 3 attack combo sequence where it jumps each time you press basic attack to create ice shocks. It has a wide circular AoE, and the AoE increases after the first hit. It will also inch closer to the target it's locked on, so technically you're not stuck in one spot. It has a 20-second cooldown. The attacks will actually freeze certain and smaller enemies, which makes it a great tool for crowd control, and even when the attacks are over, smaller enemies who approach the remaining frost can get frozen. You can delay each attack to a certain extent to time your attacks when necessary. Delaying your attacks is great to wipe out a wave of enemies and then have another attack damage the next incoming wave of enemies. It's also very useful to dodge certain enemies' attacks by going airborne and timing your attacks correctly. Each attack increases your glacial damage and resonance skill damage by 4%, stacking up to 3 times, so it's important to use and hit enemies to buff up consistently. As you might already know, there are a variety of echo swap cancels in this game where if you swap to another character during an echo skill, an echo will still continue its attacks. Unfortunately, Lampy Lumen Myriad is not that kind of case, and you can only immediately attack right after its 3rd hit. For a support build, you'll want to use Impermanence Heron, which deals havoc damage. Tap your echo skill to fly high up and dive down on enemies. If you hold your echo skill, you'll fly up and continuously shoot fire. I don't actually recommend holding because it takes up a lot of time and it keeps you airborne for too long. Sometimes this version of the skill might activate by accident. I recommend dash cancelling it and using a plunge attack to get back down quickly. When the tap version of the skill hits an enemy, you will gain 10 resonance energy, so it is extremely useful to use to fill up your resonance gauge. Fortunately, you can swap cancel this echo skill. One of the most important things to do with Sanhua is holding your basic attack to start up your Forte gauge during certain animations and situations. This allows you to attack much faster, help you decide whether to use a normal heavy attack or heavy attack detonate, or to keep holding so that you can move around freely and dodge and find the right moment to use either heavy attack. For example, starting with your resonance skill, during the skill animation, start holding your basic attack right after so that when she lands on her feet, you can immediately release a heavy attack detonate. Same goes for a resonance liberation. Start holding during the long liberation cutscene and you will be able to use a heavy attack detonate as soon as the animation is over. You can hold your basic attack during the long heavy attack detonate animation and use normal heavy attack shortly after as well. And if you're using her 5th basic attack, just keep holding during the jump animation and you can perform a heavy attack detonate right away. Now, holding your basic attack during your intro skill is super important and can lead to many different situations, but I'll explain more in detail in the flowchart section of this guide. If you want to start up the gauge even faster, you can just keep holding basic attack and use your skill or liberation and keep holding. Honestly, I think it's too much to preload the cursor like this, but it's good to know that it is an option for Sanhua. Keep in mind that once you are hit and stagger, the cursor on the Forte gauge resets, so make sure you dodge accordingly. Note that certain light attacks will not reset the cursor. Now, before we talk about Sanhua's flowchart, we have to first keep a few things in mind. First, prioritize getting her buffs up. Freezing Frost's 5-piece set bonus gives you 10% glacial damage when using a basic or heavy attack, and that can stack up 3 times. Bonus tip, you don't even have to hit enemies for this to activate. Sanhua's basic attack 5 increases Ice Burst damage by 20%, can increase her crit rate by 15% if you have S1, and gives 1 stack of clarity, and yes, you don't actually have to hit enemies to activate these either. After using Lampy Lumen Myriad's Echo skill, it increases your glacial damage and resonance skill damage by 4%, stacking up to 3 times. You would actually have to hit enemies for this one. Use a healer or buffer's outro skill if you can to get some buffs, and use your intro skill too. And a few other things to know that may affect your flowchart. After using her intro skill, her resonance skill damage is increased by 20% for 8 seconds. The ice creations made from her liberation and skill last for 5 seconds, and the one created from her intro skill lasts for 8 seconds. Also keep in mind what your weapon passives are. Some increase your attack if you use an intro skill, so you can base some of your flowchart on those types of conditions. At S5, all ice creations will explode on its own, which can affect your flowchart. Just 2 quick final notes. The normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 combo is a crucial way to set up buffs, but in some situations it might be hard to pull off. You might get interrupted every second by enemies, so sometimes you really don't have to go out of your way to use it just to set up buffs. You can just use your Echo skill and Resonance Liberation and skill. With that being said, you don't always have to use your Echo skill either for buffing purposes or even offensively, especially when you have an enemy that moves around a lot like Thundering Tempest. You may end up missing and wasting your time and become stuck in one spot. It's good to use and have since it's strong and buffs you up, but Sanhua's overall kit and the ability to move around freely can be more valuable at times. Okay, now let's look at our DPS flowchart first and use everything we learned. First, we'll talk about entering combat with your intro skill, which is probably the most common way you start off. When you enter with your intro skill, you should be doing 2 things. 1. Hold down your basic attack to start up the Forte gauge as quickly as possible as mentioned before. 2. See if it's best to pick an offensive or defensive option depending on what the enemy is doing. Let's branch out and talk about the 2 most common offensive options. The first and ideal option is using a normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 so that you can buff up. This scenario is best when a boss enemy is downed or there's a wave of enemies that you need to fight off that keep coming. This is also the best option after an intro skill in my opinion if you have S5 since the Ice Prism will detonate by itself and you don't have to worry about it so much. Now use your Echo skill to get the remaining buffs and hold your basic attack during the last hit and do a heavy attack detonate and shatter the Ice Prism. In an ideal situation, you should have enough time to detonate it, but sometimes it is not as practical. So either you would skip the Echo skill for later or forget the heavy attack detonate or just use your resonance skill or liberation instead. The second most common offensive option after your intro skill is to use a heavy attack detonate. This scenario is best when there are smaller enemies who get pushed back from normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 and you will be too far from your Ice Thorn to shatter it. But if you have S5, I do not recommend this option ever since the Ice Thorn will self-detonate. Next, ideally, you want to use a normal heavy attack to basic attack 5, and then your Echo skill to buff up. This order can be switched though depending on the situation. If things are hectic and enemies are attacking from all sides, an Echo skill may be better first. So now we used a few offensive options and buffed up. What is the next part of the flowchart? Now if your liberation is up, use that first so that you can empty out and refill your liberation gauge, followed by a heavy attack detonate, then resonance skill, and finally a heavy attack detonate to swap cancel. If your liberation is not up, just use your skill, and heavy attack detonate, and swap cancel. If your liberation is up after gaining some energy from your resonance skill or heavy attack detonate, use it, and heavy attack detonate to swap cancel. Now there are 2 other offensive options worth considering after using your intro skill. If your liberation is up, your enemy has low HP in general or low on health and you want a quick finisher, or you're running low on time for a challenge, go ahead and use your liberation without any buffs. And then do a heavy attack detonate and ice burst both ice creations and stack the damage. Then either use your resonance skill to heavy attack detonate to swap cancel, Or if you have enough time, use your Echo skill first to buff up your Resonance skill and Glacial damage, and then use your Resonance skill to Heavy Attack Detonate to swap cancel. The other option after your intro skill is using your Echo skill first. This is best when the battlefield is very hectic and you need to take a second to freeze and crowd control the enemies and think about your next move. It's also great when you're just exploring and want to kill things quickly. Then follow up with a Heavy Attack to Basic Attack 5 for the next buff, and Heavy Attack Detonate to detonate the Ice Thorn. This order can be switched depending on the situation. Use your Resonance Liberation, Skill, and Heavy Attack Detonates the way that was mentioned before. Now the defensive option after your intro skill is actually to just keep holding your basic attack and dash cancel your intro skill. Now as you walk around freely, look for an opening to attack and you have two options. 1. You should use your normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 for larger enemies who won't be pushed back or if you have S5. Then follow up with an echo skill for the remaining buffs. Or 2. You should use your heavy attack detonate on smaller enemies who get pushed back and ice burst the ice thorn, followed by a normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 to echo skill to buff up. And then use your resonance liberation, skill, and heavy attack detonates accordingly as mentioned before. Now let's talk about the flowchart when your intro skill is not up. You have 3 options here. 1. Ideally, you want to start things off with a normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 to buff up followed by an echo skill. 2. You can start off with an echo skill if things are hectic and you want a bit of crowd control if the enemies are very spread out or during exploration to kill quickly. Then use a normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 to buff up, and either use your liberation or resonance skill to heavy attack detonates. Or 3, if your liberation is up, your enemy is low on health and you want a quick finisher, or you're running low on time for a challenge, go ahead and use your liberation, followed by a heavy attack detonate. Then, either use your resonance skill to heavy attack detonate to swap cancel, or if you have enough time, use your echo skill first to buff up your resonance skill and glacial damage, and then use your resonance skill to heavy attack detonate to swap cancel. Note that if your energy regen is not that high, it can be difficult to consistently have your liberation up. If this is the case, feel free to use your liberation first instead of proccing any buffs since those extra hits fill up the resonance gauge. Now for the support flowchart, which is completely different and fairly simple compared to the DPS flowchart. Your main job as a purely support role is to fill up your concerto gauge as quickly as possible so that you can use your outro skill and buff the normal attack of the next party member. As mentioned before, as long as you detonate an ice creation made from your resonance skill or liberation, you will gain concerto energy, and you can detonate multiple ice creations at once. When you do this, the concerto energy stacks. Another reminder, the ice prism from your intro skill does not give any concerto energy when detonated. So your basic goal in flowchart is to detonate the most amount of ice creations as possible and have consistent uptime for your liberation. As a support role, you can look at these ice creations as blocks of concerto energy waiting to be harvested. First, try your best so that Sanhua is able to use her intro skill so that it restores some concerto energy. But if you can't use it, the following flowchart stays the same. You have 2 options. The first option is if you do not have your liberation up. First, start off by tapping your echo skill to gain resonance energy quickly. Now, if you get your liberation up, use it first, and then follow up with a heavy attack detonate. And then use your resonance skill and another heavy attack detonate. If you don't need that much concerto energy or have limited time, just use your skill or your skill plus your liberation if it's up and do just 1 heavy attack detonate to stack the ice creations. Now if you don't get your liberation up from your echo skill, just use your skill and a heavy attack detonate. And if your liberation finally comes back up, use it and do another heavy attack detonate. If you are still unable to fill up your concerto gauge, the last thing you can do before swapping out is use a full basic attack 1 to basic attack 5 combo to fill the most concerto energy possible, or the usual normal heavy attack to basic attack 5, which is quicker but restores less concerto energy. If you feel like you are using up too much field time, swap out for the time being. The second option is if you have your liberation up. First, use your liberation, followed by a heavy attack detonate, and then your resonance skill, followed by another heavy attack detonate. If you don't feel the need to do 2 heavy attack detonates, just use both your resonance, liberation, and skill and use 1 heavy attack detonate. If you are unable to fill up your concerto gauge this way, use a full basic attack 1 to basic attack 5 combo for the most concerto energy, or the usual normal heavy attack to basic attack 5 for faster results. And finally, to finish everything off, use your echo skill and swap cancel. This way, Sanhua will fill up her resonance gauge a little bit for the next rotation even though she's not on the field. Just a reminder, if you're enjoying this video so far, please like and subscribe for more videos like these. For her Forte Prioritization, focus on her Resonance Liberation first, and then her Resonance skill, Forte Circuit, Basic Attack, and then finally her Intro skill. For her purely support Forte Prioritization, it would be the same, but you don't have to level her Basic Attack or Intro skill too much. Now for her best weapons, starting with 4-star ones and her DPS ones. Commando of Conviction is not perfect, but I would say is her best 4-star weapon as of now. It has an attack percent substat and its passive increases your attack by 15% for 15 seconds after using your intro skill. From what I've experienced from playing Sanhua, she uses her intro skill pretty consistently, so the uptime for the passive attack boost is usually there. Lunar Cutter is another decent choice. It has an attack percent substat and gives you 6 stacks of Oath when you enter combat, and each stack gives you 2% attack. This effect can be triggered every 12 seconds. So you start off with 12% attack but lose 2% attack every 2 seconds, but when you defeat an enemy, you will gain 6 stacks of Oath again. This sword is very conditional and not ideal against bosses, and you will have a hard time keeping up with the attack percent stacks. If you can defeat enemies quickly, it can be an okay option. Lumen Gloss is a pay-to-play battle pass weapon and has an attack percent substat. After you use your resonance skill, your basic and heavy attack damage is increased by 20%. This effect lasts for 10 seconds and has only 1 stack and can be triggered every second. If you prefer a playstyle where you use a lot of basic attacks and heavy attacks, this sword can be for you. But Sanhua really shines with the resonance liberation and skills, so I don't really recommend this weapon unless you want to be on the field for a long time with her. Although this is a better option than the 3-star weapons, I wouldn't go out of my way to pay for this weapon. Emerald of Genesis is the 5-star option and currently her best in slot. It works pretty decently as a support weapon as well, depending on your build. It has a crit rate substat, which is very valuable, and the passive increases energy regen by 12.8%, which is great since most of her damage comes from her liberation. Also, when you use your resonance skill, your attack is increased by 6%, and this can stack 2 times and last for 10 seconds. Since Sanhua's resonance skill has a 10-second cooldown, she unfortunately can't keep up with having 2 stacks. Overall, it's a great weapon, but once another 5-star sword comes out that boosts damage percent or increases liberation skill damage, this probably won't be the best in slot anymore. Also, this sword can be great for support builds that focus on damage, especially with the energy regen. For support weapons, I would say Scale Slasher is her best in slot, pure support weapon. It has an energy regen passive, and when you use your resonance skill, it restores 8 concerto energy, and this can be triggered once every 20 seconds. As I mentioned before, one of the main goals for a support build is to restore as much concerto energy as possible, and this is the best weapon for it. It will also give you great uptime for your liberation with the energy regen substat. The passive becomes even better at R5 and is amazing if you don't care about damage. Sword of Voyager is the next best choice for the energy regen substat and the passive where you can recover 8 resonance energy when you use your resonance skill. If you don't have any of the mentioned support swords, feel free to use any of the DPS ones mentioned and focus on getting energy regen from your echoes. For her DPS echoes, go with the 4-3-3-1-1 build starting with Lampy Lumen Myriad. As the main stat, go for crit rate or crit damage late game. If you have a weapon that has crit rate, go for crit damage and vice versa in the future. For early to mid game with 4-star echoes, attack percent is good too. And then you have your 3-cost echoes, with the choices being Roshroom, Tamburnist, and Auto Puppet Scout, and you want a glacial damage bonus main stat. And for the 1-cost echoes, you'd want attack percent main stats. For substats, focus on crit rate and crit damage, followed by resonance liberation damage, resonance skill damage, heavy attack damage, plus basic attack damage and energy regen equally. For her support echoes, go with the 4-3-3-1-1 build starting with the Impermanence Heron. If you are concerned about damage and want to get decent substats on all of her echoes, go for crit rate or crit damage late game, and again, if you have a weapon that has crit rate, go for crit damage and vice versa in the future. If you don't care about damage at all, go for attack percent. For the 3-cost echoes, you have a choice between energy regen and glacial damage as a main stat. It almost feels like a waste to not go for glacial damage because her liberation damage is still very strong. If you want a very reliable and consistent uptime for your liberation, go for energy regen. Otherwise, go for glacial damage and focus more on energy regen substats. For the 1-cost echoes, go for attack percent main stats. For substats, if you want damage, go for crit rate and crit damage followed by resonance liberation and resonance skill damage and energy regen. For substats, if you want pure support, focus on energy regen and anything else may not be worth the resources. Now for team comps. As I say for every guide, if your team can clear the main story content and you enjoy using them, use that team. I will be only giving my suggestions and recommendations. I want to first start with her DPS teams. I believe Sanhua works great with dual DPS teams with characters who have similar damage output as her, need some field time, and have buffs that benefit each other. Let's first start off with a completely free-to-play team. Sanhua, Yang Yang, and Bai Zhe are a really great team in my opinion. Yang Yang is built for DPS on this team, and she doesn't fall that much behind in terms of damage either, and if she has most of her sequence nodes, she'll even do a lot more damage. She can dish out damage alongside with Sanhua and quick swap and mainly using the resonance skills, echoes, and liberations and other fortes quickly. Yang Yang also has a special forte called Feather Release, where she does a series of mid-air attacks and lands and does a lot of damage at the end, and this is considered basic attack damage. And this is just perfect when you get Sanhua's outro buff. Sanhua also benefits off of Yang Yang's outro buff, which gives 4 resonance energy per second for 5 seconds, which is perfect since a lot of Sanhua's damage output comes from her liberation. And to top it all off, Yang Yang is great at crowd control and gathering enemies. Bai Zhe will always be a good teammate with Sanhua. Her outro skill can buff all type damage by 15% for 6 seconds. Bai Zhe's synergy with Sanhua becomes even better at S6, where if you pick up Bai Zhe's Euphonia, it increases the team's glacial damage by 12%. Another great team is with Jin Xian and Verena. Again, Jin Xian is going to be built as a DPS and she can also do a good amount of damage. Jin Xian's outro skill buffs Sanhua's resonance liberation damage, which makes Sanhua insanely strong. Sanhua's outro skill will also benefit Jin Xian. Sanhua is able to let Jin Xian truly shine as a damage dealer, and they can share a similar amount of field time before swapping. Plus, Jin Xian can gather enemies with their liberation. Verena will be able to buff both of them and be the best healer on this team for now. You can also have Bai Zhe as well. Now for her support teams. Sanhua's outro skill that buffs up basic attack damage makes her irreplaceable for many main DPS units that focus on basic attack damage. As of now, Sanhua is one of the best support units for Encore because when Encore uses her liberation, her attacks convert into basic attack damage. Their rotations work great together, but Encore should focus a little bit more on getting energy regen substats for better liberation uptime. Sanhua is also great with Lin Yang, and the obvious reason is Lin Yang utilizes a lot of basic attacks. But another great reason they work well together is that Sanhua can quickly refill her Consotor gauge, and Lin Yang can use his intro skill faster, which is super important for him to restore his lion's spirit. As of now, Sanhua is pretty decent for both Havoc and Spectral Rover, although I do recommend Dungeon for Havoc Rover. Sanhua is another option you can consider. Sanhua is a decent free-to-play support for Kakaro since part of his kit involves basic attacks after using his liberation. But if you have Yinlin or Jianxin, it's best to use them instead. Now for her resonance chain and sequence nodes. For S1, Sanhua's basic attack 5 will increase her crit rate by 15% for 10 seconds. This is very helpful and can help build Sanhua easier if you can focus a little more on crit damage. Her S2 has 2 parts. 1, the stamina cost of heavy attack detonate is reduced by 10. 2, her anti-interruption is enhanced for 10 seconds after using her resonance skill. A stamina reduction is welcome since you need to dash and avoid attacks, and the anti-interruption will be helpful to follow up with heavy attack detonate. For S3, Sanhua's damage is increased by 35% against enemies below 70% HP. To me, this is an insane sequence node for a 4-star character and is a valuable damage boost even though it's somewhat conditional. Her liberation can really clean up enemies with this damage boost. S4 has 2 parts. 1, her liberation refunds 10 resonance energy. 2, her heavy attack detonates damage is increased by 120% within 5 seconds. Any energy refund is always nice for both DPS and support builds, and the heavy attack detonate damage boost is really nice too, and would be a great follow-up after your liberation with some extra time to use it. S5 also has 2 parts. 1, crit damage of Ice Burst is increased by 100%. 2, Ice Creations will detonate on their own even if you don't use heavy attack detonate. The crit damage bonus is amazing because Ice Burst by itself feels like just okay damage. Now in regard to the Ice Creations self-detonating, I still believe you should still follow her flowchart and consistently use heavy attack detonate. I believe the sequence node should just give you some freedom to miss detonating an ice creation once in a while, but the plan should stay the same for both DPS and support builds, but this is my opinion. S6 is a great support node. After an ice creation from either your resonance skill or liberation is detonated, all team members' attack is increased by 10% for 20 seconds. This stacks up to 2 times. This makes her even a better support unit. Thank you very much for watching my guide. Sanhua is my favorite character in this game, so I hope you enjoy using her too. If you liked the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. I'll be making more videos in the future like this. Take care now. Bye.